Hello everyone, my name is Cody Beinert. Today I thought it would be awesome to talk about one of my favorite ambient records of all time, which at the time of dropping this video is celebrating its 30th birthday, and that is Aphex Twin's Selected Ambient Works Volume 2. I really don't know if Aphex Twin really needs that much of an introduction because I doubt any of you watching don't know who he is, but just to make this hopefully a bit more formal without being boring, at least I hope so. Aphex Twin is the musical moniker of the English electronic composer Richard D. James, who is not only a man who is able to wear the most disturbing smile I think I've ever seen a human being make, but he is also a brilliant artist. To my knowledge, he became well known for his somewhat eccentric nature and personality, which is not only seen in the aforementioned creepy smile that is found on some of his album covers, but also through some of the bullshit he likes to say. According to a Pitchfork article that covers this record in question, he claimed to sleep just 2 hours a night, and that he could achieve lucid dreaming, which he can apparently take advantage of to write his music. Another fun example of his weirdness is on a song on his Window Licker EP that is very fittingly titled, he fucking hid his face in that song Spectrogram. You're essentially listening to his face. I bring this up to really kind of set the tone for how often very left field and strange he was, both as a person and as a composer. But it made him an incredibly unique figure in electronic music, especially for someone as quote-unquote mainstream as he can be. As a result, you can very likely expect something like Selected Ambient Works 2 to be an incredibly strange experience to listen to, and yeah, you'd be more than correct. While his really great debut record, Selected Ambient Works 85 to 92, had an already somewhat hefty runtime at 74 minutes long, Saw 2 is over twice its predecessor's length at a whopping 156 minutes. Which, by the way, depending on the version you own or listen to, that length can reach up to 10 minutes longer at 166 minutes. Listening to this album all the way through can, as a result, be somewhat of a large undertaking to get through. And believe me when I say it took me quite a while to have the motivation and time to be able to do so myself. However, I will also say that its length is, surprisingly enough, pretty much justified, at least in my opinion. While this album's predecessor dabbled more so in more melodic and accessible ambient techno and IDM, this record in question not only explores more traditionally quote-unquote ambient soundscapes, but it also dives into more adventurous, diverse, and oftentimes emotional territory. Nearly all the songs on this record feel and sound vastly different from each other, which can understandably make it a kind of disjointed experience for some. However, while there are certain other composers that you can, I guess, arguably compare this album to, namely stuff like Brian Eno, Jean-Michel Jarre, and maybe Tangerine Dream, the album as a whole has a really unique identity that I'm pretty certain no other record out there has. It is a vast, expansive, immersive, and endlessly fascinating experience that I feel really takes the listener on a fever dream-like sonic journey front to back, and really showcases the versatility and artistic potential of ambient music as a genre, making it an album that I honestly would recommend for people who aren't into ambient music to try out, despite its intimidating length. It is a bit tricky to cover this thing as a whole since there are so many songs, and all of them are so different and unique. And I feel like doing a track-by-track review can maybe be kind of lame, but I will do my best to summarize this thing because it is immense. The opening 4 tracks really effectively introduce the kinds of emotions and sounds that the listener will be approximately experiencing throughout this album's runtime. Cliffs and Radiator, especially Radiator, are both haunting intriguing, creepy, and very memorable tracks, before Rhubarb introduces the album's less creepy and more sentimental and emotional nature that it can have as well, with these very ethereal and soothing, yet slightly mournful melodies that play repeatedly to create a very hypnotic effect that most, if not all, of these songs have in some way. To directly contrast this, Hanky is comprised of these nightmarishly atonal harmonies and synthesizers that did in fact once play literally in my nightmares. But also, in my opinion, it is just as effective and beautiful as its predecessor, Rhubarb, just in a completely different way. Lengthier tracks that follow this, such as Grass and Curtains, showcase this album's ability to justify lengthy runtimes by utilizing certain themes that repeat throughout, while also playing around with them, bringing in different interesting layers of sounds that sort of come and go to make things both hypnotic yet musically interesting. This was very likely inspired by Eno's ambient explorations, but I personally feel Richard really adds his own unique experimental personality to this compositional style. While songs 5 to 8 are somewhat similar in tone, for they are all kind of spooky and surreal, just in slightly different ways, track 9, Weathered Stone, is a groovier and arguably more danceable song, even if it does still possess similar ambient qualities to the rest of the track list. The song is characterized by a pretty mean-sounding bass line that gives the track somewhat of an attitude, for lack of a better term, really making it stand out and adding a sense of versatility and surprise to the mix without sounding overly out of place. The following track, Tree, is a masterful dark ambient piece comprised of really eerie, swelling pads and slow pace and dissonant melodies to evoke a sense of deep and profound dread that persists throughout the song's nearly 10-minute runtime. This surreal sense of dread continues, albeit in slightly different ways, on the following two tracks, Domino and White Blur 1, which both end side 1 on a very haunting note. Side 2 then begins with the more comforting yet slightly melancholic Blue Calx, before that vibe kind of continues with the eerily beautiful Parallel Stripes, one of the more straight-up drone songs on the album that creates an interesting ambience with these buzzing, running refrigerator-like sounds. The album's weird sense of contrast continues with Shiny Metal Rods, a kind of dark and urgent-sounding piece of percussive electronic noises. It's admittingly pretty groovy and danceable, but also somewhat tense. Then Gray Stripe sort of continues this idea of, like, relatively noteless electronic noises with what sounds like a 5 minutes alien transmission or something. And to add a further sense of surprise and intrigue, Z-Twig is the brightest and most happy-sounding piece of music on this whole album, comprised of these bubbly, xylophone-like sounds to create an airy and hopeful atmosphere. The next couple of tracks, depending on the version of the album, both have more emphasis on using a driving beat as an essential part of the instrumentation. The first in question, called Windowsill, is more atonal and surreal, while the other, Hexagon, is more melodic and relaxing. However, to my knowledge, if you listen to the vinyl or cassette version of this record, in between these two songs is the deeply melancholic and beautiful piece, Stone in Focus. It is a slow, lengthy, minimal, and understated piece with these simple and kind of meticulously crafted melodies and chords that are incredibly moving. I don't remember who said this about this song, but I remember finding a YouTube comment somewhere describing this song as something like, if life was a video game, this is the main menu theme, which honestly feels pretty accurate. Similar kinds of things can be said for the very bittersweet sounding track Lichen, which is pretty much the last time the album throws anything more pleasant and less dark before the listener has to go through the somewhat harrowing final leg of this whole record, which comes in the form of the final 4 songs. This sort of, I guess, dark quadrilogy of sorts begins with Spots, which is 7 minutes of eerie, droning noises backed by these samples of what sounds like a warped recording of someone speaking. I've heard from a handful of sources that this sample comes from a conversation between a police officer and a woman who murdered her husband, and that idea in of itself makes the piece even scarier. After Tassels continues the momentum of dark and dreadful ambient drones, White Blur 2, possibly the most disturbing piece on this album, is 11.5 minutes of these off-kilter melodies that almost sound like a demented music box, backed by some experimentation with a sample of someone laughing to make things feel all the more maddening. I've heard a couple of people compare this to something out of the Yume Nikki soundtrack, and understandably so, for it does present a similar surreal and off-putting tone. Finally, the whole experience comes to a close with Matchsticks, which is a piece that feels about as creepy as it is weirdly kind of grandiose, almost like the soundtrack to the monster that has been probably present throughout this entire album, finally revealing itself in all of its alien glory. So yeah, I did my best to talk about each of these songs and the experience that one may have listening to all of them as concisely as possible, but still, it really can't be understated just how much of a fascinating experience it is to listen to this whole album or explore all the different songs at your own pace. 30 years later, this album is still a masterpiece of ambient music, and it is one of the most ambitious, immersive, and powerful records I have personally ever heard from this style of music. There really is nothing else quite like it out there, and while I understand how the length of the album can be kind of intimidating and how the nature of the music itself can make it kind of challenging in places, I'd say it is still worthwhile just to listen to however many songs you want from this thing at a time. There very likely is something for anyone on here. And so yeah, those are my thoughts on this Aphex Twin record. Please let me know in the comments, what do you think of this album? Even if you haven't heard it yet, I do hope my review helped to intrigue you enough to potentially check it out. As always, thank you so much for watching, and I will see you guys next time.